John Wayne and Dean Martin were both men who had survived the long arc of fame, and by 1979, that survival had come at a cost. Duke had already beaten lung cancer once in the 1960s, losing an entire lung, and he wore that survival like a badge of honor. But cancer doesn't respect toughness. In the late 1970s it came back, this time in his stomach, spreading quietly, relentlessly. By the time most people knew, it was already winning. Wayne, the symbol of strength, was shrinking. His once towering frame had withered. His voice was thinner, his walk slower. And worse than the pain was the way people looked at him. Friends, fans, even strangers spoke in whispers around him, avoided eye contact, or stared too long, as if they were already attending his funeral. For a man who had spent his life projecting certainty and power, that kind of pity was unbearable. Dean understood this instinctively because Dean had spent his own life hiding pain behind humor, behind cool, behind performance. He knew that what kills a man faster than illness is being treated like he's already gone. That's why when Dean showed up at Duke's house, he didn't soften his voice or lower his eyes. He didn't say, "How are you holding up?" or "You look strong." He looked at his old friend and insulted him, the way only someone who truly loves you dares to do. And when Duke laughed, really laughed, it wasn't because the joke was clever. It was because, for the first time in months, someone had seen him as John Wayne, not a dying legend. They sat together that afternoon like they always had, trading stories, teasing each other, avoiding the subject that hovered between them without ever needing to be spoken. Dean talked about bad movies, bad producers, the stupidity of Hollywood. Duke complained about doctors and diets, and how they wouldn't let him eat what he wanted. There were long pauses, but they weren't awkward. They were the kind of silences that only exists between people who don't need to perform for each other. At one point, Duke admitted quietly that he hated how everyone treated him now, like he was fragile, like he might break if they spoke too loudly. Dean didn't reassure him. He didn't offer false hope. He just nodded and said, "Yeah, I'd hate that too." That was Dean's gift. He never lied to make people feel better. He told the truth in a way that made them feel less alone. When Dean eventually stood to leave, Duke struggled to get up, embarrassed by how weak he felt. Dean didn't rush to help him. He waited, letting Duke do it himself, preserving what dignity he could. At the door, Duke looked at Dean and said, "You're the only one who still treats me like me?" Dean smiled and replied, "That's because you are you. The rest is just noise." They never said goodbye in any dramatic way. No speeches. No confessions. Just a handshake that lingered a second longer than usual. John Wayne died a few months later, on June 11th, 1979. Dean Martin never spoke publicly about that visit. He didn't tell the story on talk shows. He didn't turn it into a sentimental anecdote. But people close to him said that after Duke's death, Dean was quieter for a while, reflective in a way that felt different. He understood something deeply by then, that at the end of a life filled with applause, awards, and mythology, what matters most isn't how many people admire you, but whether someone still sees you clearly when everything else is falling away. Dean Martin gave John Wayne that clarity in his final days. Not comfort, not hope, not denial, just respect. And sometimes that's the greatest kindness one legend can give another. He didn't ask about pain levels. He didn't ask what the doctors were saying. He didn't say you're brave or you're fighting. Dean knew Duke didn't want to be a patient or a symbol. He wanted to be a man, so Dean talked to him the way he always had. He mocked. He complained about Hollywood. He told Duke about terrible scripts he'd been offered, and even worse, producers who thought they were geniuses. He made fun of his own drinking, his own failed marriages, his own bad choices. He treated Duke like a peer, not a project. And slowly, visibly, something changed in John Wayne. His shoulders relaxed, his face soft. The tension that had been sitting in him for months began to loosen. For those 2 hours, Duke wasn't dying. He was alive. He was laughing. He was John Wayne again. At one point, Duke tried to stand up and nearly lost his balance. Isa instinctively moved forward to help him, but Dean gently waved her off. "He's got it," Dean said. Duke steadied himself, stubborn as ever, refusing to be helped. When he finally sat back down, slightly winded, Dean grinned and said, "See, still dramatic. You always did like an audience." Duke shook his head, smiling. "You know why I like you, Martin?" He said, "You don't bullshit me." Dean shrugged. "Waste of time at our age." Eventually, the conversation slowed. Duke grew tired, the kind of tired that settles into the bones and doesn't leave. Dean noticed immediately. He stood up without making a fuss, without drawing attention to it. At the door, Duke looked up at him, suddenly serious. "Everyone comes in here acting like they're saying goodbye," Duke said quietly. "You didn't." Dean met his eyes. "Because you're still here." Duke swallowed hard. "Yeah," he said. "For now." They shook hands, but Dean didn't let go right away. It wasn't sentimental. It wasn't dramatic. It was just two men acknowledging something neither needed to say out loud. As Dean turned to leave, Duke called after him, "Hey, Dean." Dean turned back. "Thanks for not treating me like a corpse." Dean smiled. "Anytime, Duke. Try not to die before I see you again." Duke laughed one last time. John Wayne died on June 11th, 1979, just weeks after that visit. When the news broke, Dean Martin didn't give interviews. He didn't attend press events. He didn't tell stories about their friendship. But people close to him said that he was deeply affected, quieter than usual, reflective in a way that felt heavy. He understood something most people don't realize until it's too late, that when someone is dying, what they often need most isn't comfort or reassurance. It's dignity. It's to be seen as who they still are, not who they're becoming. Dean Martin gave John Wayne that dignity when almost no one else could. He stripped away the illness, the fear, the mythology, and met his friend where he still lived. Not as a legend, not as a patient, but as Duke. And for a man who had spent his life being larger than life, that final gift mattered more than applause, more than awards, more than tributes ever could. Dean understood something most people don't learn until it's far too late. When someone is dying, they don't always need words. They don't need speeches or prayers or reassurances that everything will be okay. Most of the time, they already know it won't be. What they need is to feel like themselves for as long as possible. Not a patient. Not a tragedy. Not a lesson in courage. Just themselves. That's what Dean protected that day. He protected Duke's identity. He refused to let cancer rewrite who John Wayne was in his final weeks. He didn't let the sickness steal the last thing Duke still had control over, his dignity. After Duke's death, Issa Wayne said something quietly to a family friend that never made the papers. She said, her father talked about Dean after that visit more than he talked about anyone else, not because Dean had said something profound, but because he hadn't. Because Dean hadn't turned their last time together into a farewell scene. Duke didn't want a final conversation wrapped in meaning. He wanted normal. He wanted arguments. He wanted jokes. He wanted to be irritated and amused and alive. Dean gave him that. And when Duke drifted in and out of consciousness in his final days, Issa said that sometimes he'd smile suddenly for no obvious reason. When she asked him why, he once whispered, "Martin's an idiot," and smiled again. That was Duke's way of holding on to the last moment someone treated him like he wasn't dying. Dean never spoke publicly about that visit, not in interviews, not in documentaries, not even to most friends. He didn't need credit for it. He knew what it meant. He knew he'd done the right thing. But people close to Dean said that after Duke died, Dean changed in small, almost invisible ways. He became more sensitive to how people were treated when they were sick or vulnerable. He hated hushed voices. He hated pity. He hated the way people spoke around grief instead of through it. If someone was ill, Dean would crack a joke. If someone was struggling, he'd treat them like they were still strong. Not because he didn't care, but because he cared deeply. That visit with Duke wasn't bravery. It wasn't denial. It was love expressed in the only way Duke could accept it. Dean didn't say goodbye because goodbye would have been for Dean, not for Duke. Goodbye would have eased Dean's conscience while making Duke face something he wasn't ready to face. Dean chose discomfort over selfish closure. He carried the unsaid words himself so Duke wouldn't have to, and that's the quiet heroism in the story, not the joke, not the laughter, but the restraint. In the end, Dean Martin didn't give John Wayne hope. He didn't give him comfort. He gave him something far rarer. He gave him a moment where the world didn't shrink him down to his illness. A moment where John Wayne wasn't a dying legend. He was just Duke, sitting in his living room, trading insults with an old friend. And when Dean walked out that door for the last time, he left knowing he'd done the hardest thing a friend can do. He stayed true to who someone was, even when it hurt to pretend they weren't slipping away. Dean thought about it for a moment, and then shook his head. No. Duke knew how I felt. We didn't need to say it out loud. What he needed from me wasn't a goodbye or a speech. He needed his friend, not a mourner. So that's who I was. Years later, Duke's daughter Issa wrote about that visit in her memoir, and her words revealed what everyone else had missed at the time. She said Dean Martin's final visit to her father was one of the most loving things she had ever witnessed. Everyone else who came to see Duke in those last months came to say goodbye. They came to tell him what he meant to them, to cry, to hug him, to make peace with the idea that he was leaving. And Duke appreciated it. He really did. But it drained him. Every visit reminded him that people were already grieving him while he was still alive. Dean didn't do that. Dean walked in and gave her father 2 hours where he wasn't a dying man. He was just Duke, sitting with his friend, talking nonsense, trading insults, laughing about things that didn't matter. And in doing that, Dean gave him something more valuable than any farewell. He gave him dignity. He gave him normalcy. He gave him 2 hours of feeling alive instead of feeling like a memory in progress. After Dean left, Issa said, Her father looked at her with tears in his eyes and a smile on his face and said, "That's the first time in months someone treated me like a man instead of a patient." That moment stayed with her forever, because she understood something then that most people never do. Dean had given her father a gift no one else could. The story of Dean. Martin's final visit to John Wayne isn't really about Hollywood legends or famous men at the end of their lives. It's about what it means to truly love someone who is dying. Most people who visit someone in that situation come for themselves. They come to say goodbye so they won't carry regret. They come to express their feelings so they can find closure. They come to make peace so they can move on afterward. Dean didn't come for himself. He came entirely for Duke. He gave Duke what Duke needed, not what would have made Dean feel better. And what Duke needed wasn't sympathy, tears, or carefully chosen final words. He needed to feel like himself one last time. Dean could have walked into that house and cried. He could have told Duke how much their friendship meant to him. He could have said a proper goodbye, and Duke would have understood. He would have appreciated it. But Dean knew Duke had already heard all of that from everyone else. What Duke had been given was relief from being treated like a dying man, so Dean refused to play that role. He carried the weight himself and protected his friend from it. That was an emotional distance. That was restraint. And restraint, in that moment, was love. When Dean Martin died in 1995, his daughter Deanna spoke about her father's philosophy on death and friendship. She said her father believed that when someone is dying, the kindest thing you can do is not make them feel like they are. Don't center every conversation on illness. Don't speak in hushed, fragile voices. Don't reduce a person to what's happening to their body. Treat them like the person they've always been, because that's who they still are, even when everything else is failing. That's what her father did for Duke. He acknowledged the illness with humor, joked about how thin Duke looked, how terrible he appeared, and then he moved past it. He didn't linger. He didn't hover. He just stayed. The lesson of Dean Martin's visit to John Wayne isn't about death. It's about dignity. It's about seeing the person before the disease and choosing to honor that person until the very end. John Wayne was dying. Everyone knew it. But for 2 hours on an afternoon in 1979, Dean Martin made sure Duke wasn't a dying man. He was just Duke. Still stubborn. Still sharp. Still laughing. And when Duke died, 2 months later, one of his final good memories wasn't an award or a speech or a farewell. It was sitting in his living room with Dean Martin, trading insults and dirty jokes the same way they had on the set of Rio Bravo 20 years earlier. That's friendship. That's leva. Leva. Not the kind that says the right words, but the kind that knows when not to say them. Not the kind that seeks closure, but the kind that protects someone else from it. Dean Martin understood that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is treating them exactly the same, even when everything has changed. John Wayne died, knowing that at least one person still saw him as Duke, and that person was Dean Martin.